My name is Richard Kaplan. I'm a fellow of the Oxford Global Society and professor of international relations at the University of Oxford. I'll be moderating today's discussion. We're joined from Kyiv by Daniel Bilak. Daniel's senior counsel at Kinstellar, one of Central and Eastern Europe's leading international law firms. He's served as chief investment advisor to the Prime Minister of Ukraine and principal advisor and chief of staff to the Minister of Justice of Ukraine, among other advisory roles to the government of Ukraine. But a lawyer by training and trade, Dan is currently one of the leaders of the civil defense in Kyiv, bravely defending the freedom of his country. And joining us as well is Timothy Garton Ash. Timothy is Professor of European Studies and Isaiah Berlin Professorial Fellow at St. Antony's College, Oxford. He's a leading commentator on European affairs, writing a widely syndicated column in The Guardian. We're also joined by Roy Allison. Roy is Professor of Russian and Eurasian International Relations and Director of Russian and Eurasian Studies Center at Oxford University. He served as head of the Russia and Eurasia program at the Royal Institute of International Affairs, also known as Chatham House, from 1993 to 2005. I'm going to forego any preamble about the crisis. The crisis, of course, is well known. Dan, we'll start with you, please. As I was saying, people around the globe obviously are shocked and horrified by what's happening in Ukraine. And we invite you now to share with us your view of the situation from the inside, your perspective on developments there, and also your thoughts on the way forward, please.
Yes, well, thank you very much. Actually, you left out the most important part of my biography, that I'm also a fellow of the Oxford Global Society, so which I'm very, very, very proud and honored to be, and thank you, Dennis, for inviting me. I'm a Canadian citizen. I've been living in Ukraine for 31 years. I was born and raised in a small Ukrainian village called Toronto, and I came here. My first deal in Ukraine as a lawyer was in 1991 when I acted for the Canadian banknote company in printing the new Ukrainian currency, the hryvnia. So my last 30 years have been basically a nation building exercise. And I think that, there's so many layers on which we can have this discussion. And, I'm going to try to touch on some of them. I have no prepared remarks. I apologize. There's no paper. So if I don't know how much structure there will be around what I have to say. But as Lord Denning once said to the council, or the council said to Lord Denning when he was saying, I'm not very edified by your submissions, counsel. He said, perhaps not, my lord, but much better informed. So I hope that you'll be better informed, and we can have a discussion around that. I've been quite surprised, frankly. I did an interview on CBC Television, Canadian Broadcasting Network, a few days ago, and apparently this thing has just gone viral. And it's like the world's woken up to the fact that there's this place called Ukraine, and where it is. I mean, most people couldn't find Ukraine on a map of Ukraine 3.5 months ago. And it surprised me because, these are basically things saying for the last, I don't even know how many years, certainly the 3 years when I was head of Ukraine Invest and advisor to Prime Minister Groisman. I mean, that's all I talked about for 3 years. It just shows you what a great advocate I am. It probably had almost no impact. But in all seriousness, it was because people were prepared to buy into the narratives. They were prepared to buy into the largely Russian engineered narratives about Ukraine. There was no way we could stop that informational juggernaut. There is this curious predilection to believe anything the Russians say, the Russian government says. Although, my basic rule of thumb is if their lips are moving, they're lying. But there you go. We have a whole industry around Russia experts and media and everything else. And it's like Stalin said, I have I have agents abroad and useful idiots, and you can take your pick where most of the Western media was in this part. I certainly know where BBC Internet or online was. It was right smack firm in a pro-Russian camp, and very, very disappointing. But the point being that, you know, the world has woken up to the fact that there is this country, that it has a history, and perhaps this is the way it should be. Perhaps this is the way Ukrainian history does unfold. This is a defining moment in Ukraine's history, and it's a defining moment in Europe's history, and it's a defining moment probably in geopolitically and global affairs. I circulated to Dennis, I don't know, early this morning, somebody sent me a quote that is really going to be the framework for what I'm going to say and what I hope our discussion will be, from the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance of Canada, who's also a good friend of mine and an Oxford graduate, a Rhodes Scholar, Chrystia Freeland. She wrote, "There are moments in history when the great struggle between freedom and tyranny comes down to one fight in one place, which is waged for all humanity. In 1863, that place was Gettysburg. In 1940, it was the skies above Britain. Today, in 2022, it is Kiev." And, you know, being here on the ground, you know, when you hear the bombs going off and missiles firing, and you see the terrible slaughter of children and women, you know, the Russians targeted a natal hospital yesterday outside of Kiev. Everybody died, all the mothers and children, and you know, it just drives home the point that freedom has a price. And I think that much of the world, especially the Western world, has forgotten that. We're now, I can't, my math is bad. I don't even know how many generations after the Second World War. But certainly, you know, my father and his generation that fought that war, and their lives were informed by that war, certainly understood that freedom has a price and that you have to fight for it. My generation, and certainly my children, grew up sort of feeling that, you know, freedom is an entitlement. You know, freedom is the right to use your iPad whenever you want, to text messages, to hang out with your friends and say what you want, and all of that is very true. But there was the equation that was missing, was that there was no responsibility attached to the preservation of that freedom. It was somebody else's. The government's supposed to do it, or what have you. And I think that people ended up becoming quite complacent, and in many cases quite cynical about what freedom and the preservation of your rights and the privileges that you enjoy, what that cost is. And, you know, it was a great frustration to me for many years, but especially in the time leading up to the current events, that it was very clear that we were all on our own. Nobody was going to come to our defense. We basically had, you know, 8 years ago during the Euromaidan revolution, you know, we had 6,000 troops. That was it. I mean, we fought the Russians off with guys and girls in construction helmets and sneakers and hunting rifles, and that's how weak they were at the time, that they couldn't go further than what they did. It wasn't a great sign of strength, but that was also opportunistic on the part of Putin, because he likes, until now, his calculation is significant gains at low or no cost. And I think that Ukrainians have shown, certainly I hope the democratic Western, freedom does come at a price, and there are some things worth dying for. And those things are exactly the fact that you do not want to be told how to live. You want to have the freedom to make your choices. And this is this great debate about Ukrainians and Russians, which I hope has been put paid to finally. You know, we're all one nation and all this kind of stuff, which is just bunk, because there was no Russia until Peter I, as you know. We have people on this call who are much better informed in this than I do, but it was Muscovy. And Muscovy, until the late 17th century, didn't have a footprint in what is today Ukraine. But the notion of Ukrainians and Russians being one nation is never been certainly something Ukrainians have accepted. And when you have that great sense of freedom, because Ukrainians have always been landowners and they've been tied to the land, and as we know, where the rule of law comes from, and in the UK and Britain, it's tied to the fact that you are owners of land. You have a piece of something, and this is actually a really important point, because in Ukrainian land ownership, in its essence, is privatna vlastnost. It's something privately that is integral to you. In Russia, it's частная собственность, which is part of a whole. And that also creates an entire worldview about your relationship with power and your relationship with your neighbor. And Ukrainians have never liked governments, mostly because they didn't do anything for them, and mostly because they were always somebody else's. Whereas Russians couldn't live without the good Tsar. And hence you have two policies, two societies, one that grew up as feeling a sense as being citizens, and the others as being subjects. Timothy Snyder at Yale has written very, very eloquently on, as he always does, on this topic. But it's vital to understand what has happened since independence. And it's vital to understand what has happened in the last 8 years since the Maidan Revolution. The Soviet era and before that, the Tsarist Russia really tried to obviously not just subjugate, but eradicate anything to Ukrainian as a separate identity, as a separate language, as a separate culture. And they were not able to do that. At the same time, and we suffered terribly. We had the Holodomor, where 5 to 7 million people died of a man-made starvation that Stalin tried to use to break the back of Ukrainian nationalism and to collectivize these land-owning farmers. And then the Second World War. I always reminded my German friends who feel they owe this great debt to Russia for the suffering of the Second War. I remind them that if they feel they owe a debt, it's to the Soviet Union. And if you want to get more particularly, it's probably to the Ukrainians and Belarusians, which did 2/3 of the dying. Ukrainians, Belarusians did 2/3 of the dying in the Second World War when Germany was occupying Ukraine. So all of this has come to a head with independence, and it also means that as Ukraine has gone westward, especially after the Maidan Revolution, that was a clear breaking point, tipping point for the country. There was nowhere to go back. People understood. And now you have a generation of Ukrainians born in independent Ukraine, the 30-somethings, Gen Z and millennials, that have no recollection of being with the brotherly nation of Russia. They have no recollection of the Soviet Union. And frankly, Russia is completely irrelevant to their lives. And the tipping point for us came in terms of European values, when we got the EU-Ukraine, where we got the visa-free travel given to us or negotiated as part of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. So people were allowed freely to travel to Europe, and they came back, didn't have a refugee crisis and everything else. And they saw how people live in the West, and they like it, but they would much prefer to have what their Western neighbors have, but in Ukraine. And that has created a demand for institutional reform. And this is what I've been involved with for 30 years, is building the institutions of state from scratch. Ukraine never had a parliament. It never had its own, except for very, very brief periods of time in the 20th century. But it didn't have the institutional memory, even of the interwar period that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe had. So you had to build a parliament, a government, a legal system, judiciary, civil society, all of which had to be built from scratch. And there's this sense that in Ukraine it was always the glass was half empty instead of half full. We've done this and this and this. Yeah, but you have to do this. So the perfect was somehow the enemy of the good. And you always had to achieve more. And I realized that during my last stint in government that basically this was an excuse to not allow Ukraine into the EU, not allow Ukraine into NATO. I mean, Ukraine, for all of the terrible things you heard, was no less or no more corrupt than than our neighbors. I think our senior judiciary, my wife is a Supreme Court judge. I can tell you that nobody leans on her, and she's an administrative court judge. So no, she's not under any influence to take her decisions, and her colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. When you compare that to some of our neighbors, immediate neighbors to the West, EU countries, there are questions about the independence of the judiciary. We've done more to reform the country in the last 8 years than any other country in the world, and both in terms of digitization, in terms of transparency, et cetera, et cetera. And still, just wait. You're not good enough yet. You're not good enough yet. Except the only people that actually really noticed was Putin and his cronies, and this became a massively potentially destabilizing factor inside Russia that they greatly feared. All of what's happening now is about keeping one guy and his band of KGB cronies in power. It has nothing, of course, to do with Russia's its national security interests, and nothing to do with its economic interests. It's just ludicrous, the claims that they were making. And so the lead up to this period is that this is all a lot of context, and perhaps I'm going into this too long, but it's Putin. When I was listening to his speech just before he announced the invasion, recognizing the independence of so-called Donetsk National Republic and Luhansk National Republic. I mean, aside from the fact it was pretty unhinged, I texted a journalist friend of mine. I said, this is just great. This is going to be great evidence for his war crimes trial. I mean, if the guy ever wanted to lay out a crimes against humanity, genocidal view of what he was going to do, this was it. And that's what's come to pass. It's his own words. And I don't know how many of you saw the clip on or the recording of the National Security Council of Russia. These guys were terrified. They couldn't even remember their lines. You have the head of the foreign intelligence arm of the Russian Federation who's shaking at the podium and saying, yes, I agree that we should integrate the LNR and DLR into Russia. And Putin says, no, that's not what we're talking about. What you really mean is that we need to recognize the independence. Oh, yeah, that's what I mean. These guys understand. They understand what's at stake. And so, this really is a defining moment. And I think Ukrainians have shown, we've been at war for 8 years. The West woke up 3 months ago. And that's why everybody says, how can you do this? We've been waiting for something like this for 8 years. We've been trying to work around it, and it's cost us heavily. Because, having been responsible for foreign direct investment into Ukraine, it was absolutely Sisyphean in terms of trying to move the dial. So everybody talks about country risk. What about Russia? What about the war? What about corruption? What about all this? And shifting the needle on narrative was, Ukrainians didn't help themselves, but to a large extent, we couldn't get that narrative of the good things that were happening out. So we now have 8 years of this. We knew this was going to happen. And what we actually taught the world was, don't be afraid of Putin, because this was the biggest problem that we had in trying to, even leading up to this, when people were talking about, we're not going to fight, we're not going to bring, which, okay, we can have that discussion, but, it didn't stop them in Iraq, Iran, and or Iraq, Kuwait, and Syria. But, he has nuclear weapons, oh my God, and he's got this huge army, and he's going to invade us and attack us, so we'll slap sanctions on him. Okay, that's, it is what it is. But they did arm us, and they continue to arm us, and that's been a real game changer. But I think the world has lost its fear of Vladimir Putin. And now there's nothing worse for a dictator. Once you ask Ceausescu and Milosevic and all the others, of course, you can't ask them because they're all dead. And that's what happens when your societies lose their fear of the dictator. And now the battle that is taking place at this stage is not about conquering Ukraine. It's about the survival of President Putin himself. And we're now entering perhaps the most dangerous phase, because he's a cornered rat. He knows he's going to, the ship is going down. You know, the size of the Russian army has always been their leverage, but the quality of that army and its fighting spirit and its technological and technical prowess, et cetera, is now being tested, and it's not that good. I mean, I cannot understand why I am having this conversation with you today over the internet, 6 days into the war. First thing you do, and we all bought radios. I got my, you know, for my own defense unit, we got our walkie-talkies. I bought a satellite phone. I've got batteries galore, backup. We all expected that our comms were going to be taken down. They haven't been. Couldn't figure it out. And then I asked one of my contacts in the military, like, what's going on? And he says, they don't have any radios. They're all using mobile phones. Can you imagine the treasure trove of materials that the American intelligence is picking up because of this and giving to the Ukrainians? I mean, you know, not a sign. They can still do a lot of damage. They've got some very heavy artillery. I hear it every night. It's highly destructive, but there's no will to fight. They really don't have the will to fight. So he is a war criminal. He will be put on trial. Probably, I hope, for genocide. Russia is paying, everybody is shocked. I don't know if any of you speak Russian. You can go on the internet and see the announcement that was made in Sheremetyevo airport the other day when all these people were stranded because the announcement was that your skies of Europe have been closed to Russian airplanes. People went ballistic. They didn't know. Everybody's just waking up to this. You know, the Russians aren't even picking up the bodies of their dead. They're rotting in the streets in Kharkiv and other places because they're afraid to take them home. The Ministry of Defense of Ukraine has set up a hotline for Russian parents to call to try to find out whether their kids have been taken prisoner or have been killed. And the Russians have blocked that and taken that down too. This is not over by any stretch of the imagination. We are going to be faced with some very, very difficult days coming up right now. There's a 65-kilometer column coming from the north. There's a 27-kilometer column of armor coming into Kharkiv. But Putin has failed. 6 days in, he does not control one Ukrainian city. He, if you look at a map, he controls bits and pieces around the edges. He's lost almost 6,000 troops. He's lost 300 tanks. He's lost 700 or 800 today armored personnel carriers. He's down to almost no rockets, which is good news. He does not control the skies. And this is the other part. I'll finish on this. You know, the West bought into the propaganda too. I couldn't understand. I was reading everywhere by military experts, very well-respected people. Not Rusi, by the way. I give them credit. But that, you know, that the are going to slice through Ukrainian defenses like a hot knife through butter. Because although Ukraine is spruced up, et cetera, the Russians are super professional after only 8 years, because they rebuilt their army too during this time. They're super professional. They're going to march in a cave in 2 days. It's going to be done and over, and we have to prepare for what's going to happen. There might be some resistance in a partisan war, et cetera. I've served in the government. I know lots of people. I just, where do you get this stuff from? Officials just said, keep your mouth shut. Don't say anything. It says there are going to be lots of surprises. And that's what happens. I mean, we will never surrender. We will never surrender. There is no way, even if this column comes in and he takes Kyiv for a period of time, he can't hold it. He can't hold Kyiv. He can't hold Lviv. He can't hold Kharkiv. Can't hold Kharkiv. I mean, if you wrap your head around that. That was supposed to be the first place that was going to lie down and allow him to take over. You know, and there is, okay, coming to my now last point. This is total opposition. This isn't just the Ukrainian army fighting against the Russians, and this is where this has always been a psychological war. Putin yanked the chain of the West, although Biden brilliantly weaponized US intelligence by putting it out there. And everybody was freaking out. My family in Canada is freaking out. I said, guys, you don't understand. You're collateral damage right now. This is a toe-to-toe intelligence psychological war that is going on between the US and Putin. They're turning the hybrid war that Putin started on his head. And the fierce resistance, these soldiers that were taken prisoner are being told that they were going on exercises. They didn't even know they were going in a war in Ukraine. And so their fighting spirit is dropping like a rock. We see that from the people we take prisoner. Whereas ours is rising like a phoenix. And I know in my own community, I'm involved in setting up territorial defense units in our region and in the community. I'm an advisor to the head of the military administration in my region, and so I'm coordinating a lot of this stuff. And I'll tell you, these guys, every single person is now the enemy to the Russian soldiers, and that's terrifying. That's terrifying when you think of it, and the thing is, the Russians are running out of gas. This is why they needed these negotiations to pause. They had to regroup. They were very close to just running out of gas, food, and fighting spirit. It doesn't mean they can't do a lot of damage, and they will, because there's still a lot of kit that can be brought. But he has united the entire world against him. And he's a pariah. Sergei Lavrov wasn't even allowed into the Security Council meeting in the UN the other day because he was under sanction. This is a huge blow to his ego. These guys are now pariahs. And I've always maintained that this war will not be won or lost in Ukraine. It'll be won or lost in Russia. And that's what we're starting to see right now. Can those subjects turn themselves into citizens? Thank you.
On that note, Dan, thank you very, very much. I think actually it's a good time to bring in Roy, if I may, on the point you've just made about the mood and thinking in Russia. You referred to Putin as a cornered rat. And Roy, I wonder if you could give us a little bit of insight into what the thinking is. It's very hard to generalize, I realize, but among the public, the elite, if there's any evidence of growing opposition against Putin, if there's any hope that he can be challenged from within. Any observations you might have, please.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, Daniel, that was a very powerful statement. It really, I think, for us outside, gives a sense of the immensity, I think, of these events, and the way that they had so many sort of multifaceted impacts through all the way through to global security. Now, on the question of Russians as subjects, and here I think, of course, this is true, and our interest, I think, in the short term, is to look at how the elite and the decision-making group around Putin respond. What kind of evidence of dissatisfaction? That will be difficult to find in the short term, but we can see that Putin himself is very concerned about that possibility. So the Security Council meeting that you referred to, this theatrical exercise, it was clearly in order for all those key figures to come to the podium and collectively, therefore, take responsibility for what was being unleashed on Ukraine. So that individually, they all carried that responsibility rather than Putin himself. Now, why would that? I mean, clearly, he felt that otherwise, these kind of factions would form around that, and that's what he's scared of. I mean, in a similar way, it's difficult to interpret Putin's insistence on this extreme distancing in talking to those around him, the long tables and so forth. I don't think he has, a fear that Sputnik vaccine will not work. after 2 or 3 doses. He's concerned that if he's out of action, if he's not there at the top of the hill, perhaps for a day or 2, that in itself opens out the opportunity for others to start to shift the power around him. And his insecurity on this is quite extreme. So I think the clear interest that this war is cutting across. Business people may have little influence on the decision making at the top at the moment, but the key matter here for the Siloviks and the security guys around him is what is it that will sustain Russia as a power in their view. And this is being undermined, of course, through the international isolation, through the economic sanctions are beginning to bite in ways that they didn't think were imaginable. So there, I think the cleavages are going to grow. And this is something we have to observe very closely. Another point that you made that I want to just focus on is the very strong issue about the defining moment for Ukraine and Europe. I think this is absolutely the case, but it's also a defining moment in the way that Russia, under this particular political structure, this regime, is viewed in the world, in Europe, among publics, amongst elites, in the international community at large. You can see the sea change in attitudes in France and Germany, for example, in Europe. There has been, you may say, an understandable reluctance to contemplate even the idea of a full confrontation with Russia in security policy terms. I mean, France has had this traditional approach of being the kind of the continental balancer, potentially, with Russia, with a reduced transatlantic link. And I think that Macron, even in his last visit, was still had something of this thinking when he went to sound out Putin's views. And as for Chancellor Scholz, the sort of peace broker, the focus on the Normandy talks, on finding some way to resuscitate the Minsk process, Putin wasn't interested in that at the time at all. I think that Putin came away with the sense that both these key leaders in Europe would not strongly react to forceful Russian action in Ukraine. But their focus was on the smaller scale issues. They didn't see the larger security picture. This has changed. This is significant. Tim may talk more about this, but the commitment to the 2% GDP spending on defense is a sea change in German security thinking. And that will hit home in Russia. Their view about Germany and what they can manage in European security affairs with Germany has been, I think, a mainstay of the approach they take to weaker countries around them in Europe. Now, I'd just like to say a few words about the goals and ambitions. Well, I think it's at one stage, conceivably, and we're talking about, well, actually, much of the period since 2014, the objective to me seemed to be to find a way to use those republics set up by Russian proxies to permanently constrain Ukrainian security policy, to prevent it from actually exercising independence in security policy decisions in future. It's not just about NATO membership, it's about many other areas. So that was perhaps a more limited objective, but that, I think, that was cast aside some time ago. The whole series of claims made in that extraordinary speech you referred to Daniel, at the start of this operation shows that, in fact, the idea even of having separate enlarged Luhansk and Donetsk republics, maybe not just as independent states but annexed into Russia, even that was just a sort of a temporary halfway house as far as Putin was thinking. We have the references now to demilitarization. Now we know what that means. This isn't about just an agreement about neutrality, prevent Ukraine from actually exercising its sovereign decision making on security policy. This is about a full control of the military apparatus, destruction of the military apparatus, preventing Ukraine from being able to defend itself in any sense in the future for the foreseeable future. And the denazification is a control of the whole national security political decision-making establishment through effective proxies. There's no other way of reading this. He talks about putting on trial those who have committed supposed abuses against Russians. So that gives carte blanche to take out any of those really that he feels would oppose in any way politically these intentions. So this is fanciful, if you like, given how you've set out the actual nature of the resistance in Ukraine. But as that, and you know, it sort of goes further. It seems that there's a reference to the recognition of different peoples in Ukraine. So not just the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, but ostensible other peoples in Ukraine, which implies a kind of breaking up of the Ukrainian state into some kind of statelets that can be controlled from the outside. I mean, all this is extreme. I mean, it's really difficult. One has to go back into history to find those kind of demands made upon a neighboring state quite far back. It's difficult also to see that all of these, I mean, these may be perhaps, I mean, it's presented in the Russian news, in the Russian state narrative. Can these goals really be seen as realistic ones to Russian peoples? They understand the Ukrainians to a significant extent. They are intermingled. There aren't a set of different peoples of this kind that have to be subordinated to separate forms of political control managed by Moscow. This just doesn't make any sense. Obviously, I mean, this is not. There's a bigger picture here as well. Now, I just close with this. Putin's larger security policy agenda is clearly indicated by the sort of forceful integration of Belarus and Russia militarily. We now President Lukashenko has decided to abandon the commitment to a non sort of nuclear policy. He's decided to abandon the commitment to neutrality. That allows Russia to effectively incorporate Belarus into its security policy to advance whatever weapon systems it wishes into Belarus. But my concern is, I mean, beyond that, with this idea of these expanding goals, that other countries are seen as also unfinished business and are vulnerable in this respect. And Georgia and Moldova come to mind immediately, which I think reinforces the point that you made at the beginning about the defining moment. The defining moment, I think, in Europe and for countries that have chosen free paths, democratic choices for their future.
Roy, thank you very much. Timothy, I want to bring you in. And in addition to anything you might wish to say about what Dan has said, if you could also reflect a little bit on the European response and whether you think they're doing all they can do, whether there are opportunities that they haven't seized. But over to you for your reflections.
Thank you, Richard. Daniel, first of all, I want to say that I'm just lost in admiration for what you and your compatriots are doing to defend your country. It is just extraordinary, both the military defense, the territorial defense you're involved in, and the preparation for civil resistance, the civil society piece. And what's for sure is that that has absolutely transformed the world's, and particularly Europe's, perception of Ukraine like nothing else. And every journalist who's been there will never forget it. Everyone now knows Ukraine is a great European country. Many are talking about it as the middle of Europe or a central European country. So that's for sure. And actually, I have to say, Richard, it's both surreal and humbling to be having an academic webinar when Daniel uses the phrase, there are some things worth dying for. And you'll be out on the streets in a few hours, Daniel, risking your life. So That's the first thing to say. Huge respect, admiration, and the impact, the long-term impact that will have on the perception of Ukraine. 3 points beyond that. Number one, unless what Roy is describing, namely a moment when elements in the Russian elite say to Vladimir Putin, either you have to change your course, or more unlikely, we have to change you, what happens in the next days and weeks will above all depend on the strength of the Ukrainian resistance, military, territorial, and civil. Why? Because if and when we get to a negotiated settlement, and I see Ivor Roberts on this call, and he knows this from former Yugoslavia, the facts on the ground, the military balance, whether the cities at least and the country as a whole has made itself ungovernable, will decisively impact what negotiated settlement there is. Really, the first thing I want to say is, Daniel, let us know what you need and how we can get it to you, which is not a strictly academically neutral comment, but these are not necessarily the moments to be completely neutral. The second point to make—
ammunition and weapons would be a good start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Oxford University is not very strong on that, but I do think there's been a shift. But this takes me to my second point, which is that what's clear, and I'm sure Roy will agree with this, is that medium to long term, Putin is achieving the exact opposite of everything that he says he wants to achieve. He says Russians and Ukrainians are one people, one nation. This is the final act which ensures, as Daniel said, that all Ukrainians, including Russian-speaking Ukrainians, regard Ukraine as one different nation. It is the final act in that process of nation building that Daniel talked about. You know, in recent history, 1991, 2004, 5 Orange Revolution, 2014 Euromaidan, and then this. He says he wants to push back NATO's military presence in Eastern Europe to pre-1997. He's achieving the precise opposite. For the first time, NATO is getting serious about the defense of its eastern frontier militarily. He thought he could divide, Roy touched on this, and I think Daniel did too. He thought he could divide Europe and America. He thought the West was weak, decadent, postmodern, vegetarian, all of that. He has created a unity of the West such as we have not seen since the Cold War. And even then it was almost rockier. Many of you will know the crisis theory of European integration, that the European integration advances through crises, going back to Jean Monnet. Not always true, by the way. It's not automatic. But this one is having that effect, that transformative effect on Europe, although I think it's really important to stress what Daniel said. 2014, this war has been going on for 8 years in the east of Ukraine. And looking back, 2014 is the turning point at which Europe failed to turn. If we had done the military support, which Daniel is talking about, sanctions of a kind we're only doing now, reduced our energy dependence in Europe such that the SWIFT sanctions could now be applied to the whole Russian economy and not just to selected banks, because we're worried about paying for our gas, so that Russia is still getting €1 billion a day in payments for gas and oil, and woken up to Putin's possible intentions, we would be in a different place. Nonetheless, the West has woken up, and this is my third point. The turn in Germany is just gobsmacking. Sacred principles of German foreign policy for decades have been thrown overboard in hours. Even 3 or 4 days ago, completely impossible. Now they're doing it, and by the way, 100 billion euros is not peanuts for any army. If Germany continues to spend more than 2% of its GDP as promised by Olaf Scholz, it will soon have one of the largest armies in Europe outside Russia, and knowing Germany, probably one of the most effective. What is still missing in the European response for all this great change on sanctions and military support and solidarity is a vision for the future of Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, and so on. Scholz said almost nothing about this in the Bundestag. It was a huge omission. And if we don't say something about that, we risk ultimately accepting a new Iron Curtain, which, as Roy was hinting, is probably the sort of median objective of Putin, not the maximal, not the minimum, but the median objective is new Iron Curtain along the western frontier of Belarus, Ukraine, probably Moldova too. And to respond to that, and I'd love to hear Daniel on this, because we're really here to listen to Daniel, I think the crucial change which is still to come is to say clearly now, and President Zelensky has asked for this, that Ukraine is an accepted candidate for EU membership, and that the EU actually wants Ukraine to be a member. That seems to me a really crucial, not just symbolic, medium-term step. And I'd be very interested to hear Daniel's response on that, as well as to the question, what do you need?
Daniel, would you like to reply to comment on what you've heard from Roy and Timothy?
Yes, actually, I'll start with that last comment. Thank you all for your excellent and erudite commentary. I'm a big fan of all of yours, frankly, from reading in The Guardian and in other publications. Look, Ursula von der Leyen has basically said that we are entitled to be fast-tracked into the EU. I mean, this is mind-warpingly stunning in terms of where we were two weeks ago. But she's right. This is the second time that Ukrainians have died for European values, for the right to be, as a European country, for the right to be a member of the EU. It happened 8 years ago on the streets of the Maidan, and happening today. No other country has done that in Europe. No other EU country has done that in Europe. In fact, you see the EU flag being burned on the streets of most capitals in Europe in protest, as opposed to people willing to lay down their lives for that ideal. Because at the end of the day, that's what the EU was all about. It was an idea. And so we should not just be allowed in. It's not about allowed in. We have a right to be there. If Ukraine is not made a member of the EU after this, the EU has no right to exist. It doesn't stand for anything. And you can fight with the Poles and the Hungarians about the rule of law principles, etc. That's a sideshow compared to what's going on right now. And again, I come back because we can be a beacon for the rest of Europe and for all democratic countries as to what it takes to preserve those very values that these countries claim to be to stand for. I mean, look, I am grateful to all of the countries. I mean, I'm in a war zone right now, so I'm extremely grateful for all the support we're getting in financial and military, etc. But Timothy's point was bang on. Had the West had the courage of their Western countries, had the courage of their convictions much earlier, and put on sanctions and been tougher with Putin instead of trying to appease, accommodate, and be afraid of him, we might not be here. So there's an argument that we are actually owed this by the EU because of their fecklessness in standing up to Putin much earlier. I mean, the whole Nord Stream 2 is, I mean, that's a whole subject of a different discussion, but I mean, it was just never in a million years did it have any credible commercial value. It was very clear. And the fact that you actually let somebody who you know is a gangster into your house to fix your to come and fix your gas problem is beyond belief. So I'm glad that Germany under the new government has finally found its way to go. So, I mean, we've talked a lot about Russia here. I would like to actually talk about Ukraine. I'm actually looking forward to all of the great Russia experts in the world now turning into Ukraine experts, because Russia, the lifespan of any empire is about 500 years at best, and Russia's just past its best before date, and so now it's time to look at why this all happened. And I think that looking at Ukrainian history, looking at Ukrainian culture, looking at the Ukrainian people, the role of the church in Ukrainian society as a key convening and informing institution of Ukrainian mentality as a whole. The fact that Ukrainian institutions are all about local government formed around the bratstvo, the church organizations that then formed into the towns and the centers. Because as I said, we never had national institutions. But yet, all across this huge country, the size of France, people spoke a common language, they had common traditions, they shared common cultures. There were variations on a theme, but there was one ethnos. Yeah, there were others as well. I mean, you don't want to make too much of the fact that this is a conglomerate of different societies. But by and large, until somebody outside stirred the pot, everybody got along. There wasn't a problem. And so I think that these are really important starting points for any academics in terms of understanding A, how we got to this point in time, B, how the divergence between Ukraine and Russia, because if anybody has a claim to Russia in terms of chicken and egg, it's the Kievan Rus. And that's Russia was a bog for 150 years after Prince Volodymyr took Christianity from Constantinople in 988. So I think that this issue of the importance of Ukraine as the fulcrum of democratic development eastward, which is what Putin feared all along, is so vital. And also in terms of helping Europe understand its own relationship with its citizenry, its own dynamic, because here governments fear the people. I'll tell you, there isn't a secret deal that's made in the corridors of power that isn't on the internet in 20 minutes, and then a demonstration in an hour out in front. There's a very, very strong civil society influence and control over how governments work. So subsidiarity, god awful word, is actually practiced almost as a religion in this country, and accountability. And frankly, Ukraine's importance geostrategically was brilliantly set out back in the 90s by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who said that there are two countries that are crucial to Euro-Atlantic security on the Eurasian. It's in a book called The Grand Chessboard that he wrote, but he also wrote an article, a seminal article in Foreign Affairs magazine. And that was Ukraine and Azerbaijan. And they said, without those two countries, without those two countries, Russia will always be an empire that threatens the West. And that's exactly what we've seen. So there are so many different levels now. I mean, academics have just got a whole new lease on life. And there are so many different levels at which to analyze this, from a geopolitical standpoint, from a European integration standpoint, from a civil society, development society, from a citizen-state relationship, from a constitutional, organizational aspect. I mean, I can go on and on. But this is also important for countries like France and Germany. France has been absolutely robust and stalwart in its support of Ukraine. Unheard of. And somebody commented earlier about, may have been Roy, about France's predilection for all things Russian. And President Macron has been absolutely dead on. In fact, the French embassy was only evacuated yesterday, and they went under protest. They did not want to leave, the diplomats. And from my time in government, when I started negotiations between France and Ukraine on a government-to-government loan when I was heading up Ukraine Invest. And that's when I realized that something's changing here. For France, up until the Maidan, I suspect, the borders of Eastern Europe started on Alsace-Lorraine. There was the German ambassador told me at the Institut des Langues Orientales, one of the languages was German. So it gives you an idea of where their heads are, but not anymore. And France was all in where? All in the East. They were huge funding. So there was a change that was starting to take place already in terms of a new geopolitical alignment in French strategic thinking. And Germany just got a massive come to Jesus moment. They realized that the values that they purport to stand on are outdated in terms of what their actual policy application and implementation is. And we have seen, as Timothy pointed out, is just a head spinning about face. And Putin has just destroyed everything he had. He's got exactly 180% what he did not want and what he claimed that he did not want. But you can always expect the Russians to overplay their hands. The difficulty is that the Russians are transparent about everything. There's no guile here about they telegraph. They'll tell you, when they say we hate you, we're going to invade you. Watch out, they're probably going to do that. And had they taken Ukraine, but the Balts would have been next, the Finns would have been next, Slovakia would have been rocked. This was not going to stop. And because he would have been empowered. He was like the genie in Aladdin, all the powerful in the world, tiny, tiny living space. And that's what he's got now. And in fact, at the negotiations, I was texting with some senior officials the other day. I said, you should put forward at the negotiation that you want to see all Russian troops rolled back beyond the Urals and a buffer between the Urals and Ukraine. But strategically as well, Putin has just killed himself with the Chinese, which actually is really where his national security and geopolitical threat lies. He had no issues in the West. There was no national security problems for Putin in the West. If there had been real ones, he probably wouldn't have done this. But now he has a serious problem because he's been immensely weakened. I mean, this isn't over yet, don't get me wrong. But if what he's got left and he throws at us is destroyed, he doesn't have an army. He put 2/3 of his conventional forces on Ukraine's borders. 2/3. He rolled the dice. He was so confident. I mean, our greatest challenge and our greatest advantage is that Putin, and many Russians, but Putin believes his myths and propaganda about Ukrainians. He actually doesn't understand who we are at all. And this has been a big wake-up call. They're livid. Now he's finding people to blame. He's firing generals. Head of the general staff was fired, etc. But it's not going to do anything. The other thing that I wanted to say is about the government here. Until Thursday, there was a very strong sense that President Zelensky was not ready for prime time, that he was not going to be a wartime leader, and that he was just too lightweight. His Minister of Defense, Oleksiy Reznikov, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs, for example, Dmytro Kuleba, as well as General Zaluzhny from the Armed Forces, rock solid. They've been absolutely fantastic communicators. They've been sending out great signals to the Ukrainian people, etc. But there was a sense that the president's a bit adrift. All that's changed since Thursday, and President Zelensky has been absolutely solid. He's been on television. He's been reassuring Ukrainians, "I'm here." He goes out on the streets, sort of prove with his selfie, with his telephone, that he's actually in front of the president's administration. It's done in real time. There was a comment about the table in President Putin's office, and there was a great contrast shot made in the internet with President Zelensky with his Minister of Defense Reznikov, arm around each other, doing the selfie, and then there was a picture of Putin separated by 40 feet of table with Shoigu, the Minister of Defense of Russia. It's he was a very, and the man is separated from, that's how separated he is from his own people. He's, it's what happens with dictators after 20 years. And he surrounded himself with KGB yes men. And this was all about crushing the Ukrainians because he wanted to be Peter the First again. He was also, this was part of the KGB game because he wanted to go back to when their entire identity and self-worth was in battling the United States, the great hegemon. And that's what he wanted to do. This was his way of taking on the US because he felt they were weak. And I come back to the responsibility of European countries in feeding that perception. Having said that, they rallied fantastically. Turns out that those values do matter. The entire world is, I mean, it's just horrific what's happening in our cities. But we will rebuild with their help. You know, that which doesn't kill us makes us stronger, and we will come back strong, and we will be a full-fledged player in the European community of nations. We'll make a contribution. We have the largest standing army, that knows how to fight in Europe. And this has been what we've been saying all along, is that we are not fighting just for Ukraine. We are the first line of defense for NATO and the EU, even though you don't want us to join. But we will die defending you, and defending ourselves, and defending you, and defending those principles and values. And that is now going to be hardwired into the DNA of every single Ukrainian.
Daniel, I can't think of a better note on which to end this meeting. These are very dark days for freedom, for democracy, for human rights, for fundamental principles of international order, and yet you are very upbeat, optimistic, and not for by any means groundless reasons, which is very, very encouraging. And I hope that your optimism about the future is widely shared amongst colleagues and amongst the population. I personally have been struck by the global response at the popular level as well as at the elite level. There's always more that can be done, but in many respects, the unity that Timothy talked about among the Europeans, the determination has exceeded what my expectations were. I don't know whether you or your compatriots feel in other ways let down. Obviously, as I said, there's always more that can be done. But I hope that you are heartened and buoyed by the solidarity, expressions of support that are coming from across the world, and I hope that you can help us to identify ways in which outcomes that we all want for Ukraine can be achieved. So I'm going to bring this to an end. I want to thank.
If I could just say, say one thing,
please, please, please.
It's always darkest before dawn.
Yes.
And if anybody wants to find out how they can help, please contact the Ukrainian embassy in London. Vadim Prestaiko is the ambassador. He's a good friend of mine. He's a great contact and resource, and the embassy will direct you to how you can help us out. Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Thanks for having me.
I want to thank you. I want to thank our other commentators, Timothy and Roy, the Oxford Global Society, for hosting this, for the very many participants. We had well in excess of 350 at one point. But again, Dan, very much thank you for your bravery, for your courage, for your inspiration. And we wish you and your family and your compatriots all the very best. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you. Slava Ukraini.
Slava Ukraini.